So we are in...
We are on the island of Oritigia, which is the old city of Syracuse, on the island of Sicilia. See?
Yes.
And this is the story of how the Battle of Syracuse changed world history. But first I have to ask the question that I've primed you for. Who was the greatest poet in Italy?
Dante.
Hey! Gold star, Dante. And Dante's most famous poem was...
La Divina Commedia.
La
Divine Comedy.
Yeah, Divina Commedia. Which is divided, as you know, into heaven, purgatory, and hell. And in L'Inferno, the hell portion, he divides hell into concentric circles. Each circle is worse, in other words, and the people in it are worse. And when he gets to the very central circle of hell, that is the circle for traitors. And there are 4 traitors being tortured there. 2 of them are Italians nobody ever heard of. One of them is Judas Iscariot, and the 4th is Alcibiades. Now, you may or may not recognize the name Alcibiades, but you will as the story of Syracuse goes on. We left our tale after the Peloponnesian War had been going on for 12 years, and Nicias ended it in a negotiated settlement called the Peace of Nicias. But there were some malcontents on either side who felt they could have won if only the politicians hadn't stabbed them in the back. And the worst lot was the school of Socrates. Now, Socrates has gotten a very good rep because his student Plato wrote all these things about the great philosopher Socrates. Well, he may have been a great philosopher, but he was also something of a reactionary aristocrat. And his specialty was taking on as students those similarly inclined. At this point in time, about 424 BC, his students were about a group of 20-somethings, approximately the age of these two, who were bad boys. No girls, they were all bad boys. And their leader, the most charismatic of these 20-somethings, was named Alcibiades. And Alcibiades was politically ambitious. He wanted to become the first man of Athens, and he figured that was hard to do in a time of peace. So he was lobbying for resuming the war against Sparta. So after they would meet and do philosophical stuff with Socrates, they'd get around with some ouzos and plot how they were going to take over Athens. And because Athens was a democracy at that point, so all decisions were made in these huge amphitheaters with all the people of Athens, except, of course, women and slaves, it was reasonably easy to sway them with clever arguments. And Alcibiades was a good orator. So they decided, what we need is a act which will definitely piss off the Spartans, so it'll start the war again, but also get us off to a good start in the war. And I've already explained how you can't attack Sparta, because they're the strongest militarily, and they're about 100 miles from the sea, so what's Athens going to do about that? Well, Alcibiades was thinking to himself, you know, the thing that most scared the Athenians was that the Spartans would find some way to get superiority at sea. They had Corinth as an ally, but the Corinthian fleet, together with the Spartan fleet, still couldn't do the trick. But there was that colony of Corinth out there way over in Sicily called Syracuse. It had the 3rd biggest fleet in the Greek world after Athens, Corinth, and Syracuse. And during the first 12 years of the Peloponnesian War, the Spartans had kept lobbying the Syracusans to send their fleet over to help, but the Syracusans always said, oh, we're having trouble over here, we're fighting the Carthaginians over here, we can't do that. But it was still a problem. So Alcibiades decided they should do a surprise attack on Syracuse. Have Athens attack Syracuse without any provocation, without any warning. That way they would either sink the Syracusan fleet so it could never be used against them, or they could capture a big bunch of it, which was kept in the Piccolo Harbor over here, and add to their fleet. So with the first blow, they would not only piss off the Spartans and restart the war, but they would guarantee that they could never be harmed at sea. A nice plan. So they present it at the next assembly, and it wins a majority vote. So Athens votes to go to war again. But the Athenians were not too thrilled with Alcibiades because they knew he was a ambitious little punk. So they said, okay, it was your idea. You can be admiral of the fleet that goes against Syracuse. But we want 2 admirals of equal power. The other one would be Nicias. Yes. Grazie. Chin chin.
Salute.
To Nicias. Because he's the leader of the peace party, pissed as hell that they'd voted to end his peace, so they could count him to counter Alcibiades. Well, it's never a great idea to have 2 equal admirals of a fleet, but things went from bad to worse because the night before the fleet was to sail, and this was virtually the entire Athenian fleet, because they knew they were up against a big enemy here in Syracuse. Bellini. So the night before, they all the young 20-somethings went to Socrates' house and got roaring drunk, celebrating the fact that they'd gotten their way and were about to sail on Syracuse. And they went running through the streets of Athens, and they thought it would be funny to mutilate all the Hermei. Now, if you know what Hermei is, in those days...
Grazie. Salute.
Salute, Sabino. Salute, salute. You can still see Hermei in some museums. They were a square column, about this thick and about this tall, and they had the bust of the god Hermes on the top, which is why they were called Hermes. And Hermes was the god of travelers. And halfway down, even though the column was not shaped like anything but a column, halfway down the column was an erect penis in stone, pointing in the direction that the column said it was. So if it was to the Acropolis, you would follow in the direction of the penis.
Wow.
Now, you've got to understand that these Hermes were dedicated to the god and therefore holy. Well, these drunk 20-somethings went around chopping all the penises off the Hermes. And then they crashed at dawn, and a couple hours later they got up and led the fleet off into the sea. Well, the Athenians noticed what had happened to the Hermei, and they had they knew who had done it, and they had a trial of Alcibiades in absentia, and they convicted him of sacrilege, which is punishable by death.
Strong one.
So they sent the state barge after the fleet. It took a while to catch up, and meanwhile a couple of Alcibiades' friends who remained behind sent a faster ship to say, look out, trouble's a-coming. And so Alcibiades jumped ship. Now, if he had just jumped ship, he would be a footnote in history. But he didn't just jump ship. He went to Sparta. And he said, "Oh, Spartans,
No way.
there's something you want to know."
How did he get off the...
He's a
Well,
spy.
the ship, Athenian ships landed every day, and at nightfall, and went up on a beach. So he just jumped ship when he'd heard that the barge was coming. So he went to Sparta. He told them all the plans, but the Athenians did not know this at the time. So the Athenian fleet sailed on to Syracuse, and they get to Syracuse, which is one of the biggest cities in the Greek world at that point, and well walled. And they start a siege, and because you can't break down walls in those days, so they just surrounded it and tried to starve it out. But it had springs. Remember the springs? So they had water. That's it.
Okay, take a little breather.
And they had quarries. Remember I said the quarries were going to figure into this. So it's hard to create a ring of defensive positions around a city, because you're going to siege a city, you have to block off all entries, or people will sneak out to get sheep and bring them in and have food. But the whole of the northern part beyond Oritigia is pockmarked by these mines and quarries. It's very hard to create a defensive line. And they never did succeed in blocking off Syracuse. It did just fine. And a couple months went by. Meanwhile, the Spartans had not been asleep. They got together their fleet and the Corinthian fleet, and they sailed after the Athenians. They figured they couldn't take on the Athenians themselves, but if they managed to get here before Syracuse fell, they might be able to combine with the Syracusans' fleet and outnumber the Athenians. So the Athenians brought their hundreds of ships into the great harbor, and each day they would come and yell obscenities at the Syracusans and throw things at them. But basically, they would then go on that area there, kind of just this side of the entry. They would line up all the hundreds of ships on the beach. But at some point, it became clear that Syracuse wasn't going to fall and this wasn't going to work. And rumors were getting back to them of naval activity at their rear. Scary. So, it was decided that on a particular day, the fleet would admit defeat and sail back for Athens. Well, that night, there was a total eclipse of the moon.
Wow.
And some soothsayer named Anne-Marie, no doubt,
Would say there's no coincidence.
there's no coincidence.
The
This
gods
is a
are in
bad
our
omen. You should not sail tomorrow. So
Never.
Nicias, who after all now, the old man Nicias is the only remaining admiral of the fleet, is a superstitious man, and he says, okay, we won't sail today. We will wait a week before we sail.
Okay.
In that week, the Spartan navy and Corinthian navy arrived
Got it
at
going.
the entrance, and what they did with the help of the Syracusans, and it's amazing when you look how far away that side of
Not
the
easy to
harbor is.
defend.
They put a line of ships across the entire entry, and they ran a chain between the ships. So they had this huge chain. The Syracusans had this chain to be used in this sort of circumstance, but with all these ships, they just ran the chain across the whole entry to the channel,
Created
trapping
their wall.
all the Athenian ships inside.
Oh, brilliant.
Now things are really grim for our friends.
Beginning it.
So they try a few things. They try marching around a bit, but always the armies are on either side of them. So finally they decide one night to try to surprise the chain and burn a few of the ships and get through. So the Athenian navy attacks. It almost succeeds, but it fails. So they're beaten back, and so they do the only thing they can do at that point. They abandon the ships, burn them, because they don't want them to fall in the hands of the Syracusans and the Spartans, and they march north, trying to get to some little towns that might be friendly to them because they hate Syracuse. But they don't make it. They're picked off one by one, and the entire fleet is burned, and the entire army is either killed or captured and sent to work in the mines.
For you there.
Only a handful ever returned to Athens. And, I mean, to make a long story short, the Peloponnesian War continues for more than 20 more years, but Athens' advantage is gone. It's now hit and miss. They have to begin with, they have a smaller fleet than their enemies. Of course, they start building like mad. But in the end, the fact that they could no longer convincingly rule the seas put them in the position where they could win as many sea battles as they wanted, but if they ever lost another one, lost the rest of their ships, they would lose the war, and that did happen up by Istanbul. 20 years later, there was a battle in which their remaining fleet was destroyed and they lost the Peloponnesian War. But in a way, they lost it here, on the day that
big
Nicias
defeat.
saw the full
And
moon.
the total eclipse of the moon.
That was very
Didn't
nice,
say
Roger.
that.
Wow. Well, the crucial week,
A
strategically.
crucial week.
Enough time to build up your defenses or
Yep.
offenses.
Very nice.
And
Roger.
that's the story of how Syracuse changed history.
Wow.
Athens lost the Peloponnesian War.